Faith's a funny thing. In just about every other realm of human endeavor, whether it's business or science, technology, construction, even the arts, we base all our decisions on endless measurement. And yet, in the matter of our inner life, we search for a sense of protection, relief, guidance, hope, and it appears to me we literally will it into being ourselves. Our next speaker, John Geiger, has collected many testimonies of people who in extreme situations have experienced a savior, a vision, if you will, that has led them out of danger. I'd like him to come up and explain. And, well, I'll pose you one question when you're done.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here, Moses. Thank you very much. I'm going to start by relating an incident that happened to me when I was 7. I was in southern Alberta. My father's a geologist. He was with the Alberta Research Council, and he was doing a study of the bedrock topography of southern Alberta, and I was, I think it must have been during the summer, so I was kicking along. I was along for the ride. And we were going up, it's a very arid part of the province near Lethbridge, and I was going up a steep embankment, and I came face to face with a rattlesnake, which is actually a lot more terrifying than when you see it at the Toronto Zoo. They're mean creatures, and my father was ahead of me, and I was sort of frozen, and the snake was coiled, and I was afraid it was going to lunge at me. And then I had a very odd experience, and I don't know to this day whether it actually happened or whether it was a 7-year-old embellishing what was already a pretty good story. And that is that I had a sense that I was detached from myself. And when I look back at this incident, and to this day when I look back at the incident, I see the snake, and I see my father, and I also see a little boy who would have to have been me. So I was actually seeing this scene, and it's over the years as I've reflected, I've always seen it the same way. I see it from a different perspective. So either I have an inventive imagination, which I hope is true, but also it's quite possible that I had an unusual mental experience that some psychologists have said to me is actually quite common, especially among children who are in abusive situations, that they themselves are able to step back from the abuse that they're suffering and see the events as if it's happening to somebody else. So I do think that it was an actual experience. And I think it predisposed me to the subject of the type of unusual mental events that happen to people, often in wilderness settings. So that's just to relate my own beginning and my beginning of my interest in this area. And I really came across this subject, the third man, when I was reading Ernest Shackleton, the great Antarctic explorer's narrative South, where he actually describes a very unusual incident that I'm going to talk about in a moment. I think you probably will recognize Shackleton as the middle figure here. I don't know if any of you recognize either of the other two figures. Anyone want to guess? Okay, Charles Lindbergh and Joshua Slocum, the first man to undertake a solo circumnavigation of the world, and actually a native of Nova Scotia who later became a naturalized American citizen. What interested me is very quickly after discovering Shackleton's encounter with the third man during his escape from Antarctica, which again I'll talk about in a moment, is I discovered other cases around the same time. 1895, Joshua Slocum was undertaking this amazing around the world journey. He had just crossed, he was in the process of crossing the Atlantic Ocean. He had stopped briefly at the Azores and had feasted on various cheeses there, and went back on his sloop and headed towards Gibraltar. And he was suddenly taken very ill. He was unable actually to to steer his ship, his vessel. And he found himself actually in a situation that was quite desperate because he was in the middle of a terrible storm. And he essentially collapsed in the cabin. He was not at the wheel. And he became unconscious at some point. But then he awoke, and this is what he described. And I'm doing this as a PowerPoint because I want you to actually see the words of these people. When I came to, I saw a tall man at the helm, his rigid hand grasping the spokes of the wheel. He held them as in a vice. This figure reassured him, I have come to aid you. Lie quiet and I will guide your ship tonight. He attributed his survival that night to this intervention by what he called a spook on the ship. And he said he had the feeling that had been in the presence of a friend and a seaman of vast experience. So there's Slocum in 1895. Charles Lindbergh, I think most of you know the great story of the flight of the Spirit of St. Louis. In 1927, Lindbergh was crossing the Atlantic, the first man to do it solo. And he described later, not in his first book written about when he was very famous, very celebrated, many years later, he sort of came clean about an experience he had had in the fuselage of the Spirit of St. Louis. And that is, he felt that there were presences there, conversing, advising him on his flight, discussing problems of navigation, reassuring him, giving him messages of importance that were not attainable in everyday life. And he flew successfully. He became an instant hero and celebrity around the world, one of the most famous men of his time, and maybe of all time. And later he reflected on this experience. I've never believed in apparitions, but how can I explain the forms I carried with me through so many hours of that day? Transparent forms in human outline, voices that spoke with authority and clearness. And then Shackleton, and his story is one of the most harrowing of all. You probably, again, Shackleton's a very well-known figure these days, especially. His ship was trapped in ice endurance. The men were forced to abandon or desert the ship, which was crushed. They dragged small lifeboats across the ice floes of the rotting ice, and finally made an escape from the Antarctic ice flows to Elephant Island. He left most of the men there, and then he took a small party, and they traveled across the South Atlantic to a place called South Georgia, which is a British possession in the South Atlantic. There was a whaling station there, and he knew that he would be aided at that point. But it was during that crossing in a small boat, the James Caird, and then landing in the midst of a hurricane at South Georgia, he and a handful of his men then were forced to, two other men were forced to cross the mountainous interior of South Georgia, and it had never been charted, so he made his way with these two others. And over the course of that final leg of the journey, they each had, independently of the other, a sense of an unseen being who had joined them and who was urging them along. And one after the other realized that they'd all had the same experience, that there was a fourth presence that had joined them on that journey. And this is Shackleton's reference to it in his wonderful narrative, South, that he had, during that long and wrecking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, it seemed to me often that we were four, not three. This was the fourth presence. But as you see in a moment, the numbers were changed. This is an interview that appeared in the Daily Telegraph. In your book, you speak of a fourth presence. He nodded his head. Do you care to speak about that? And Shackleton became restless and very ill at ease. He said, no, none of us cares to speak about that. There are some things which can never be spoken of. Almost a hint about them comes perilously close to sacrilege. So this, Shackleton was embarrassed, I think, that he had let this little piece of information, this highly personal piece of information out. But it did inspire, the fact that he did publish it did inspire one of the most famous passages in one of the most famous poems of the last century, and that is Eliot's The Wasteland. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. So Eliot had read Shackleton's narrative, and he recognized this as a very interesting idea, incorporated it into The Wasteland, and the phenomenon has been known ever since, when it's known at all, as either the third man syndrome or the third man factor. And I'm just going to quickly run over a number of other cases and talk about what I think may be happening to these people. Frank Smythe, one of the great early British Everest climbers, 1933, was in the death zone of Everest with another man, Eric Shipton, who was unable to continue. So Shipton remained at the tent, and Smythe carried on by himself. And his interaction with the third man is quite a well-known story, because he said not only did he feel during his climb as he struggled closer and closer, within 1,000 feet of the summit of Everest, not only did he feel that he was getting, that he was accompanied by someone, that he had help, encouragement, someone along with him. But at some point, after he gave up on making the summit and started back down, he sat down and had a Kendall mint cake, a mint bar, and he actually broke it and shared it carefully and evenly with his companion. So the sense that someone was there with him was so vivid, that this helpful friend was so vivid, that he actually shared his food, or attempted to share his food with this being. Enzio Terra, in 1953, a Finn who was actually in the French Foreign Legion, and he and a Swedish legionnaire decided they didn't want to serve in Indochina, and so abandoned the ship that was taking them to Vietnam, and threw some food and a small raft overboard. And they were in a busy shipping lane in the Strait of Malacca, and they thought they would be collected within minutes, if not hours. Well, in fact, they ended up spending 33 days on this raft. At the end of this experience, he weighed 56 pounds when he was rescued. He was drifting across the Indian Ocean, pardon me. And in his book, Graft of Despair, which this wonderful cover I've included, he said he didn't pray, and I'm not a religious man usually, but for the whole voyage I'd had the strange feeling that someone else was with me, watching over me and keeping me safe from harm. So I'm going to move along. Hermann Buhl, a great Austrian climber. During those hours of extreme tension, I had extraordinary feeling that I was not alone. I had a partner with me, looking after me, taking care of me, belaying me. I knew it was imagination, but the feeling persisted. He was the first man to summit Nagna Parbat, one of the tallest mountains, one of the top 10 in the world. And he barely escaped from that alive. But through the entire ascent, he had this sense that there was someone helping him along. Bill King, a great man, still alive, probably the most famous sailor in Great Britain. He was doing a solo circumnavigation. He was going through Cape Horn and the terrible seas there. It was a situation where he couldn't see the horizon. He couldn't get a read on the sun. He didn't know exactly where he was. He was going through an area where there were small islands and reefs. He was in very serious danger, and he carried on. And through that situation, he was calmed. He might have panicked. He was calmed. And that was because, again, he was joined by someone who was helping him, sharing in the tasks. He didn't feel that his mind had become deranged. He was quite certain that he was not alone. Excuse me, this is not swine flu or bird flu. I think it's a crumpet from this morning, but you have to bear with me. Nicholas Tu, a Vietnamese boat person who made a harrowing escape in 1987 in a small raft with a large number of other people. And there, before he was finally rescued, again, the same story. Here, not an explorer, not an adventurer, somebody who was trying to escape for a better life. He seemed that he was joined by a presence. He thought it was his brother, again, comforting me at the toughest moment of his life. Stephanie Schwab, a great diver, an American, originally from Germany, also had the same sense. She was in an underwater cave system in the Bahamas, and she lost the guideline, the only way that she would be able to get out of this incredible maze of caves. And while she was there, she again began to panic. She thought she wasn't going to survive. Her air was running out. And then, once again, she had a sense that there was someone with her. She thought it was her husband, Rob, who had died a few months earlier. But she was given advice, and she calmed down, and she began to methodically look for the guideline, and with time she was able to find it and to escape. Jerry Linenger, an American astronaut, veteran of 2 shuttle missions, who had also spent a a number of years on the, years, it must have seemed like years, months on the Mir space station, which was well beyond even then its normal and anticipated lifespan. And Leninger has a PhD and a medical degree. He's an absolutely remarkable, typical of astronauts, an extremely high-achieving guy, very serious guy, very scientifically minded. He, on Mir, after a series of near catastrophic incidents on Mir, including a fire that raged out of control for an hour, he had a sense that he was joined by an unseen presence. He thought that it was his father who had died a number of years earlier, and this helped him to cope with the situation that he found himself in. And Ron DeFrancesco, who's a Torontonian now, at the time of 9/11 was actually living in New York and working in the South Tower of the World Trade Center. He's a money market trader, and he found himself trapped above the point of impact in the South Tower. He was in a stairwell. It was filled with smoke. It was blocked by debris. There were a group of people around him. Some of those people were unconscious. Some of those people had given up and were sobbing sort of uncontrollably. And he basically felt that this was it, that he would not be able to escape this situation. And suddenly he felt, again, that there was a presence there. And often in these cases, the presence doesn't just provide encouragement, a sense of calm, coping, but rather give specific advice and directions. And for Ron, those directions were to get up, to keep going, that he could escape from the World Trade Center. And so he did. He did what few people would ever do. He went into the flames. He covered his head with his arms, and he ran into the flames, and he was able to break through this debris that was there and to get down below the fire and below the point of impact. And the lights were on, and everything appeared normal below that point. And he was urged to hurry on. At that point, the presence left him, and he was able to get out. And he was the last man out of the South Tower of the World Trade Center before it collapsed on September 11th. So the question is, who or what is the third man? And there are many, many other examples in the book, and many others that I've found, countless examples, scores of examples, into the low hundreds of examples of this, of people, normal people, high-achieving people, people in disaster situations, people who are explorers, and all of them have exactly the same story to tell. And that is, when they most needed help, they were able to find that help. They were able to evoke it. So there's a lot of similarities between these cases. They are often in highly monotonous situations. They're experiencing a number of stresses, not just one particular stress, but it may be cold stress, as in Antarctica. It may be the stressful situations in the sense that there's fire, or they're adrift in the ocean in some cases. They may be at high altitude, in many of the cases involving climbers. But so there seems to be a group of stresses, or a number of stresses at play, not one particular factor that helps to evoke this experience. And what is happening to them? Well, obviously we've been talking about spiritual matters in this session, and a number of the people I've spoken to who've had this experience felt that it was an intervention by a guardian angel. So for them, it was proof of the existence of guardian angels and an affirmation of their religious faith. Lynn Robertson, who with her family was adrift in the Pacific Ocean for many weeks before they were finally rescued, she felt that Jesus Christ had intervened and was actually there in the raft at one point where a waterspout threatened to swamp them. In the case of Ron DeFrancesco, he felt that it was an angel. I asked him, what was this? How do you explain it? He said that an angel had come to help him. So that is certainly one interpretation. And if you think about the Aboriginal spirit quests, you think about the desert monks who retreated into the deserts and would come back with stories of meeting great spirits or God, or it does fit with some of the even tribal practices that we're aware of. There are also psychological theories. MacDonald Critchley, a British neurologist, was one of the first to study this, a scientist to study this in a serious way. In 1955, he published a paper. He called it The Idea of a Presence, and he actually gave it its first description, scientific description, that it's a sense, a feeling or impression, sometimes amounting to a delusion that the person concerned is not alone, that there's another individual with them. Another Julian Jaynes, an American psychologist, in a very controversial book about bicameralism, proposed this idea of the bicameral mind. His explanation for this phenomenon is that it's a right brain intrusion into the left hemisphere, that this is the God brain speaking. Peter Sudfeld, who's a professor of psychology at the University of British Columbia, said that the impression or help of encouragement by this phantom presence lends the experience great psychological immediacy. He felt that it's a coping mechanism. This is actually a human psychological response to extreme stress. And very recently, a number of neurologists have been looking at this. In one case, they actually use an electrical stimulus to explore the brain of a woman who is suffering from epileptic seizures. And at a certain point, they were able to actually induce a sense of a presence in a clinical setting. But the presence was frightening to her. It didn't have all of the layer of meaning that I've just described. So it was, in a sense, a similar experience. There was a being there with her. When they removed the stimulus, the being disappeared. But it was not a helpful companion. It was not a friend. So this is the part of the brain that's involved in telling me where I end and where you begin. So it's concerned with our self-perception and where placing us in the world. So there does appear to be an angel switch. There is something in our brain that allows us to evoke a sense of another being there. But what is interesting is it doesn't take us all the way. It doesn't explain why that being is a friend, a companion, a helper. And it doesn't explain why, fundamentally, we all appear to have a sense that we're not alone. Thank you very much.
John.
Yeah.
The remarkable consistency in these large number of stories put me in the mind of the consistency involved when people describe near-death experience. Have you ever thought of that connection?
I did think about that connection. It's a very different experience. Yeah. Near death, there's usually a sense of moving through a tunnel. There's light at the end of the tunnel. None of these people had that experience, and none of them described that. In a sense, I don't think this is a near-death experience so much as it is a near-life experience. These are people who might have opted to die. Maybe it would, in some of the cases, it would have been easier for them to die than to carry on, struggle on. And this intervention appears to be a mechanism that made it possible for them to survive.
Mm-hmm. I was pointing to not the similarity in the experiences, but the similarity in the consistency between groups of people who describe unexplainable phenomena.
That's exactly right. And what's interesting about this, I started looking, I thought, well, initially I found examples among explorers, climbers. They're all, many of them British, some German, they're all Northern European. So I started looking abroad. I found an Israeli soldier who had been kept in a jail and tortured in Egypt. I found Vietnamese boat people. I found Indian climbers. And so it seems to be a universal trait. You're quite right. And the stories are always very consistent. There's this similarity that runs through them all. It's not a freak aberration that one or two people have experienced. It's something that's common to humanity.
But is it your conclusion, therefore, it's something hardwired in the human?
I think, yeah. I think that we are hardwired for human companionship. I think we have this innate social sense. And we are calmed and strengthened by the presence of other people. And I think it very much is, I think it's a combination of these explanations. And I'm not the one who can rule in or out the religious possibilities of this. That's for other perhaps our previous speakers would be able to address that, not I.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye.